Is Marvel Rivals just an Overwatch clone? No. Cool. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Like and subscribe, and okay, we all know it's not that simple. Marvel Rivals is kind of hot right now. It's a perfect storm, no pun intended, of mega popular IP, tight mechanical design, and captivating, let's say, art direction. In short, Marvel Rivals feels like it was engineered to be a mega hit, but there's just one big Venom-shaped problem. We've seen this game before in nearly every aspect. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a little game called Overwatch?
But who is that?
This is the end of the mystery.
Well, well, if it isn't our old friend.
Nerf this.
So Marvel Rivals is a lot like Overwatch, and I mean a lot like Overwatch. If you've played it, you know exactly what I mean. It's a 6v6 hero shooter. The game modes are nearly identical. There are a lot of similarities between characters. The maps have a very Overwatch feel to them. The story is told through in-game character barks. This is a game that's wearing its inspiration very proudly on its sleeves.
It's funny you should say that, because I was looking through some old photos and it looks very, similar.
That said, Marvel Rivals doesn't feel like it's trying to hide the fact that it's trying to be a new take on the mechanics and game modes and everything else that Overwatch pioneered when it launched in 2016. In fact, NetEase commented on the comparisons in an interview with MP First when asked about how the game will forever be compared to Overwatch, saying that it's honored to be compared with some of the best games out there in this genre, and that it feels like it offers an experience that builds on some familiar gameplay elements and creates something unique. Okay, so if Marvel Rivals plays and looks and feels like Overwatch, and the studio behind it says that the game is built on familiar gameplay elements from Overwatch, then why don't I think the game is a simple copycat? Well, to answer that, I think we need to look at how we talk about games as a whole. It's very common to compare games to one another when recommending them or reviewing them because it helps us understand the specific type of experience we're talking about. Given how vastly different game genres can be, comparing new games to older ones is just shorthand for listing out how a game and its mechanics feel. Comparisons are most helpful, however, when talking about specific subgenres of games. For example, if you've got an open world game with a bunch of collectibles and icons on the map, it's like Assassin's Creed. If it's an open world game with non-linear design and an emphasis on player freedom, Breath of the Wild. See what I mean? Contrary to what a lot of people online seem to say, I think that comparing games is a helpful way to talk about them, since it gives someone who might not have played a new game the ability to generally understand how it works. That's not to say that all comparisons are good. There can certainly be a way of comparing games unfairly or too much, but it does help us understand why we compare games to one another so often. Because of how similar they are, it's very easy to compare Marvel Rivals to Overwatch, but I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to understand Marvel Rivals in the context of its similarities to Overwatch, because there are so many similarities. Despite this, I think that there are a lot of ways that Marvel Rivals uses Overwatch as a jumping off point into becoming a new experience. That idea is why I don't believe Marvel Rivals is just a clear copy, as former Blizzard Entertainment president Mike Ybarra implied it was. Game genres are all about iteration and experimentation. In other words, genres are created when ideas are shared between games and then tweaked to create new mechanics. An iterative game takes design elements from games it wants to be like and alters them in a way that makes for a different experience. When compounded over the course of decades, game genres start to shift and change, but you can still see the bones of the original ideas. For example, no one would call something like Metal Gear Solid 5 an Assassin's Creed 2 clone, because while the games have similar structures and elements, they have independent identities based on the ways that they use their mechanics. That's not a fair comparison though, I can hear you beginning to type in the comments down below. Assassin's Creed 2 came out in 2009 and MGS 5 came out in 2015. There was so much time between those two games, and the open world genre evolved tenfold in that time. First of all, I'd like to point out that Overwatch came out in 2016, and Marvel Rivals launched at the very end of 2024, more than 8 years after it. Sorry to make you feel old. Time, however, isn't the main factor here. No, it's the second point about Assassin's Creed and MGS, that the genre both games belong to evolved significantly faster than the hero shooter genre that Overwatch helped pioneer. While we've certainly seen our fair share of hero shooters since Overwatch popularized it with games like Valorant, Apex Legends, Rainbow Six Siege, and Black Ops 4, there have been significantly more new games in the open world genre in the same amount of time. It's just a more popular genre, which means that more iteration is able to happen since there are more opportunities for it to happen. Additionally, I would argue that many of the games in the hero shooter genre aren't using Overwatch as their direct inspiration, instead taking the hero elements from the game and using them to iterate on other shooter subgenres pioneered by games like PUBG and Counter-Strike. So since those popular games aren't actually iterating on Overwatch's formula, they're using Overwatch to iterate on other games, there hasn't been much iteration and refinement of the mechanics that Overwatch pioneered outside of the tinkering and tweaking that Blizzard has done over the years. Other than Marvel Rivals, I can think of two games that felt like they were heavily borrowing mechanics from Overwatch: Paladins, Champions of the Realm, and Concord. Those sorry, Lennox, two games that took mechanics popular in Overwatch and tried to remix them, while still staying true to a lot of the design elements from Overwatch. Similar to the way that people are talking about Marvel Rivals, there were plenty of accusations that Paladins and Concord were Overwatch clones. And just like with Rivals, the similarities between the games are numerous and not subtle. Despite this, they had their own twists that made them unique. Notably, Paladins has a playing card mechanic, among other things, and Concord featured numerous different game modes and told, or rather tried to tell before the game was killed, a straightforward narrative using cutscenes. From my view, Paladins and Concord weren't Overwatch clones. They're just games that fall into the same genre, but there haven't been enough entries in that genre to get people on board with the idea that a genre even exists. I think a great example of this is how people looked at Dark Souls when the franchise first became popular. Okay, this is a gaming video essay, so let's stick with tradition and talk about Dark Souls. Dark Souls is a fantasy action RPG, but when it came out, there wasn't much else to compare it to within that genre. Other fantasy RPGs from around 2011, like Skyrim or Dragon Age 2, were similar enough to one another, but nothing like Dark Souls with its obtuse mechanics and hardcore systems. The concepts surrounding Dark Souls were unique and caused the series to grow into what it's become today. Despite the fact that Dark Souls was a part of the fantasy RPG genre, it used the mechanics that made it unique to create its own subgenre, a genre we call Soulslikes, games like Dark Souls. The first notable Souls-like to release following the success of Dark Souls was a game called Lords of the Fallen.
I have been offered redemption. But at what price to my soul?
It's not remembered particularly fondly. However, I'd argue that it was that game that created the Souls-like genre, not Dark Souls. Dark Souls wasn't a Souls-like, it was just Dark Souls. Lords of the Fallen took mechanics from Dark Souls and iterated on them, following the game's lead to become the first AAA mainstream Souls-like. When Lords of the Fallen first came out, there were accusations left and right that it was nothing more than a Dark Souls clone. But now that Souls-likes are incredibly popular and a saturated genre, we don't bat an eye when a game takes heavy inspiration from Dark Souls or any of the other games by From Software. In fact, the closer a game feels to FromSoft's games, the more audiences and critics tend to like it, like with Lies of P. In my view, Marvel Rivals understands that the original Overwatch identified what makes its core concepts fun, but Blizzard has strayed far, far away from those concepts with Overwatch 2. Rivals takes those concepts and uses them as a jumping off point to add its own compounding concepts. For example, I think the team up mechanic does a good job of incentivizing players to try out new characters and switch to roles that encourage better team composition, something Overwatch famously struggles with. Additionally, while I can definitely see the comparisons between characters in Marvel Rivals and the ones in Overwatch in a vacuum, I find many comparisons to be pretty surface level and removed from the context of each character's role within the game. For example, I've seen comparisons between Tracer from Overwatch and Star-Lord in Marvel Rivals because their weapons are similar and because Star-Lord's dodge reload skill is semi-similar to Tracer's blink skill. In application, however, Tracer tends to be used more reliably to quickly flank an enemy, deal some damage, and then blink or rewind out of combat range to heal up to account for Tracer's small health pool. Star-Lord doesn't have the same mobility options as Tracer, so I find him to be most useful for keeping the heat on and jumping around the battlefield, dealing damage to multiple enemies at once, which is further incentivized by his Blaster Barrage AoE ability. That's just one example of how I read the characters and their abilities differently between the two games. People are welcome to disagree with me on this specific example, but I think there's enough variety in the characters and their roles that you can see where I'm coming from. Marvel Rivals takes a lot of mechanics from Overwatch and remixes them to varying degrees, but instead of being praised for that, like games from other genres that do the exact same thing, it's called a copy. Does borrowing elements make it a simple clone? I don't think so, because if it did, then we'd have to classify every great game as a clone to some extent. The question surrounding the originality of ideas is a very complicated one, because it means that we need to accept the fact that originality, in its truest form, simply does not exist. When art is created, it's made on the backs of every other piece of art that the artist has experienced. Some works, some games, take from more places of inspiration than others, but that doesn't always make for a better game. At the end of the day, there's no denying that there are a lot of similarities between Marvel Rivals and Overwatch, despite the fact that Marvel Rivals does a lot to remix many of the concepts that Overwatch established. That said, I think it's reductive to call it a clone or copy. Is Overwatch not a clone of Team Fortress 2? No, of course not. The conversation surrounding this Overwatch clone concept is silly to me and feels like a regression in the way that we talk about games. A regression to the 90s, where any first-person shooter was deemed a Doom clone and then a Quake clone. Aren't all games just clones of one another? If we really tried, we can find the origins of most modern game mechanics, but does that mean they're stolen or just borrowed and remixed to make new ideas? Halo 1 was designed so that you could only be able to carry 2 weapons at once. And that's a system that we see in countless first-person shooters still to this day. We've seen several major discussions and government litigation regarding copyright infringement recently with things like the Nintendo Palworld case. But the conversation surrounding Marvel Rivals and Overwatch is a bit more reminiscent to me of the recent Ed Sheeran lawsuit, where he was found not guilty of infringing the copyright of similar-sounding music for using common chord progressions. We can't own the building blocks of art. Unless, of course, you're WB and copyright an incredible game mechanic only to do nothing with it. For real though, if you want to see a real Overwatch clone, check out Legend of Titan. All right, let's see what this is all about. Here we go. Okay, yeah, Reinhardt, Tracer, sure. Kind of looks like Pharah, yeah. Well, okay, now that's stupid. Wait, hold on, you can't just do that. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.